The night I realized something was wrong, I was sitting at my kitchen table at 11:43 p.m., refreshing my bank app. It was supposed to be a routine transfer, something I'd done dozens of times before. Then I noticed my name on a document I had never seen, attached to a charity account I didn't control. My phone was face down. An email notification kept lighting up the screen. I didn't open it yet, because in that moment, everything I believed about my family still felt intact. It wouldn't stay that way. The night I realized something was wrong, I was sitting at my kitchen table at 11:43 p.m., refreshing my bank app. Not because I was anxious, not because I was short on money. It was just habit. I'd gotten home from work late, kicked off my shoes, reheated leftover pasta, and gone through the same quiet routine I'd followed for years. Check tomorrow's calendar. Set the coffee maker. Glance at my accounts. Make sure everything lined up. It always did. That night, it didn't. I noticed a transfer labeled temporary reimbursement. The amount wasn't huge, $1,250, but the destination account wasn't one I recognized. The note field was blank. No explanation. No follow-up email. Just a clean line item that didn't belong to me. At first, I assumed it was a delay or a mislabel. Banks make mistakes, systems lag. I work in compliance. I live inside spreadsheets and audit trails. I know how boring errors usually are. Still, I tapped into the transaction details. Then I tapped again. And again. The account holder name stopped me cold. It was my name. Not a typo. Not a similar spelling. My full legal name, exactly as it appears on my driver's license and tax returns, attached to a charity account I had never opened, never managed, and never agreed to be associated with. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the ceiling. My apartment was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator and the soft ticking of the clock above the sink. The same clock I'd bought at Target 8 years earlier, when I first moved to Ohio. Back then, I told myself I'd only stay for a year. Long enough to save. Long enough to regroup. I was still here. My phone buzzed. I flipped it over. An email notification lit up the screen. Preview text cut off after the subject line. Quick question, can you sign this tonight? I didn't open it. Not yet. Because up until that exact moment, everything I believed about my family still made sense. Maybe not perfectly. Maybe not comfortably. But enough that I could live inside it without asking too many questions. I grew up in a suburb outside Columbus, Ohio. The kind with wide streets, identical mailboxes, and front porches that only got used on holidays. My family was well known in our community, not because we were wealthy, but because we were involved. Church committees, fundraisers, food drives. My Aunt Cheryl had a reputation for always stepping up. Right. People said that about her a lot. She was the one who organized the silent auctions, coordinated the donor lists, and made sure the right names appeared on the right plaques. She spoke softly but decisively, like someone who expected to be listened to and usually was. If there was a crisis, Cheryl handled it. If there was a mess, she cleaned it up. And if something needed to be signed, reviewed, or quietly fixed, she called me. I didn't mind at first. I was good with numbers. Always had been. While other kids hated math, I liked the way it behaved. Add this. Subtract that. And you always got the same answer. No guessing. No charm. No politics. After college, I landed a job as a compliance analyst for a regional nonprofit healthcare network. Not glamorous, but stable. I reviewed internal controls, flagged irregularities, and made sure organizations didn't accidentally or intentionally wander into legal gray zones. I believed in the work, or at least, I believed in doing it right. My family liked to say I was detail-oriented. That was their polite way of saying I was useful. Whenever Cheryl needed help reconciling donation records or preparing reports for the charity board, she'd call. It was never urgent, never dramatic, just a favor. Just for now. Just until the next meeting. You're so much better at this than we are, she'd say, and it'll save the organization money. I told myself that was a good thing. At family gatherings, I sat near the end of the table. Not because anyone told me to, but because there was always an open chair there. Conversations flowed around me, updates about fundraisers, upcoming galas, who had pledged what. My role was to nod, smile, and occasionally clarify a number when someone asked, "Lauren, does that total look right to you?" I'd check it on my phone. It usually didn't. I fixed it anyway. There were moments when something felt off, like when I realized my name appeared on more documents than anyone else's, or when I was copied on emails that felt a little too internal for a volunteer, or when Cheryl forwarded attachments with lines like, "Just adding your name for continuity." Continuity of what, exactly? I never asked. That was the unspoken rule in my family. We didn't ask questions that made things awkward. We smoothed things over. We handled issues quietly. We took pride in being the kind of people who didn't air dirty laundry, especially in public. The charity itself was small but respected, a local organization providing transportation and support services for low-income patients. It made people feel good to donate. It made people feel even better to be seen donating. The board was filled with familiar faces, church friends, business owners, retired professionals with time and connections. And then there was me. I wasn't on the board. I wasn't listed as staff. But somehow, my name was on file with the bank. The longer I stared at my phone that night, the heavier my chest felt. Not panic, not fear. Something colder. Recognition, maybe. The kind that creeps in before your brain is ready to accept it. I opened the email. It was from Cheryl. "Hey, sweetheart," it began. "We're finalizing some paperwork for the quarter-end review. Nothing major. I added your name where it already was on previous filings, just need your signature so everything stays consistent. Can you do that tonight? IRS deadlines are no joke." Attached was a PDF. I didn't open it. Instead, I scrolled back through my inbox, searched my name, then the charity's name, then the word authorization. The results filled my screen. Emails from months ago, years ago, threads I'd skimmed and replied to without much thought. Looks good to me. Approved. No issues from a compliance standpoint. I'd been careful in my work life, meticulous even, but here, with family, I'd been casual, trusting, helpful, naive. I set my phone down and folded my hands on the table. My fingers were steady. That surprised me. I'd always imagined that if something truly wrong happened, I'd feel it physically, shaking, sweating, a rush of adrenaline. Instead, I felt very clear. I thought about the way Cheryl always spoke about responsibility, about stewardship, about doing what was best for the community, even when it was inconvenient. I thought about the times she'd laughed and said, "I don't understand any of this finance stuff. Thank God you do." I thought about how often I'd signed without reading closely, because it was late, because I was tired, because I trusted her. The clock on the wall ticked past 11:50. I opened the PDF. My name was there. Not once. Not twice. On multiple pages. Listed as an authorized signatory, a financial liaison, a compliance contact. Roles I had never formally accepted. Responsibilities I had never agreed to carry. I closed the document and sat there, staring at the reflection of my own face in the dark screen of my phone. For the first time in my life, I understood something with absolute certainty. This wasn't a mistake. And whatever came next was going to cost someone something. I just didn't know yet who that someone would be. I didn't sleep much that night. Not because I was panicking, but because my brain kept replaying small moments I'd dismissed for years, comments that had sounded harmless, requests that had felt routine. Each one slid into place like pieces of a picture I hadn't wanted to see. By morning, the apartment looked exactly the same. Pale sunlight came through the blinds. My neighbor's car alarm chirped once and stopped. The world hadn't shifted. Only my position inside it had. I showered, dressed, and packed my laptop as if it were a normal workday. In a way, it was. I still had reports to review, policies to update, meetings to attend where people spoke in careful language and avoided saying the word liability unless they absolutely had to. At work, I functioned. That surprised me too. I flagged a missing attachment, corrected a miscategorized expense, answered a question about donor restrictions with the calm confidence I was known for. No one could tell that the same skill set keeping my employer safe was now whispering uncomfortable truths about my own life. Around noon, my phone buzzed again. "Cheryl, did you get a chance to look at that doc?" she texted. "We're on a tight timeline." I stared at the message longer than necessary. Tight timelines were her favorite phrase. They made things feel urgent, unarguable. If something was time-sensitive, you didn't have space to hesitate. "I saw it," I typed back. "I have a few questions." There was a pause. Then 3 dots appeared, disappeared, and appeared again. "Of course," she replied, happy to clarify. "It's all standard." Standard. That word sat heavy in my chest. I didn't respond right away. Instead, I pulled up a shared drive I still had access to from a previous volunteer role. It took a few minutes to find what I was looking for: old folders, poorly labeled, PDFs nested inside other PDFs, the kind of digital clutter that accumulates when no one expects to be audited. Eventually, I found a set of meeting minutes from 2 years earlier, a board meeting I hadn't attended. My name appeared under a section labeled Compliance Oversight. I scrolled. There it was, a line noting that Lauren Hale has agreed to serve as a compliance point of contact to streamline reporting. I let out a slow breath. Agreed was doing a lot of work in that sentence. I tried to remember that meeting, the night, the context. All I could recall was Cheryl calling me afterward, asking if I could just take a look at some numbers because the board didn't have anyone with my background. I'd said yes, of course, I always did. At some point, yes had become something else. That evening, I drove to my parents' house for dinner. It was Wednesday, which meant meatloaf and green beans, and my mom asking if I was eating enough vegetables. Normal things, familiar things. I needed to see them, to anchor myself in something real. Cheryl was there too. She often was. She lived 10 minutes away and treated my parents' house like an extension of her own. When I walked in, she was already seated at the table, scrolling through her phone. "Lauren," she said brightly, "perfect timing." She stood and hugged me, the same quick, efficient embrace she gave everyone. No lingering, no warmth, just enough contact to count. Dinner passed the way it always did. Updates about church. A fundraiser coming up next month. A brief complaint about parking downtown. No one mentioned the document. No one mentioned my name appearing where it shouldn't. Halfway through the meal, Cheryl turned to me. "Oh, by the way," she said casually, spearing a piece of meatloaf. "We might need you at the board meeting on Saturday. Just to answer a few questions if they come up." I looked at her. Really looked at her. The confident posture, the relaxed smile, the assumption built into the request. "I wasn't aware I was part of the board," I said. The table went quiet, not dramatically, just a subtle pause, like someone had turned down the volume. Cheryl laughed softly. "You're not. Not officially. You're just involved." My father cleared his throat. "You've always helped out," he said. "It's a good thing." "I help when I'm asked," I replied. "That's different from being listed as responsible." Cheryl tilted her head, studying me. "Lauren, this is how things work in the real world. Titles matter less than trust." "Trust." I nodded slowly. "Then why wasn't I told?" Her smile tightened, just a fraction. "Because it wasn't a big deal." After dinner, I stepped outside under the pretense of taking a call. The air was cool, the sky already dark. I leaned against my car and pulled up the IRS notice again, rereading the language with fresh eyes. Responsible parties may be subject to penalties. Plural, vague, dangerous. I thought about my job, about how often I'd warned clients that informal arrangements were the most common source of serious trouble, that good intentions didn't protect anyone when regulators got involved. That systems failed not because people were malicious, but because they were careless and assumed someone else would handle it. I went back inside and found Cheryl in the kitchen, rinsing dishes. "I'm not signing anything," I said. She didn't look up. "Lauren, I'm not signing," I repeated. "Not until I understand exactly why my name is where it is, and how it got there." She turned off the water and faced me. The warmth was gone now. In its place was something harder. "You're overreacting," she said. "This organization does real good. Do you want to be the reason it gets bogged down in red tape? I want to be the reason it's done right." Her lips pressed together. You know what happens when people start asking questions. Donors get nervous, support dries up, people suffer. That was the lever. I recognized it immediately. Guilt disguised as morality. I'm asking questions, I said evenly. That's all. She stared at me for a long moment, then sighed. Fine. We'll talk tomorrow. On the drive home, my phone buzzed again. A new email. This one wasn't from Cheryl. It was from a board member I barely knew, forwarded to a group thread. Can someone explain why Lauren Hale is listed as the primary compliance contact? I don't recall approving that. My stomach tightened. I didn't respond. Not yet. When I got home, I opened my laptop and started a new folder. I named it with the date. Inside, I began saving everything. Emails, attachments, screenshots, meeting notes. Not because I was planning to use them, but because I finally understood something important. If things went wrong, no one would remember how my name ended up there. They would only remember that it was. By Thursday morning, my role in the charity had quietly shifted from helpful to necessary, and no one had bothered to tell me when that happened. I could feel it in the tone of the emails, the way people started copying me by default, the subtle assumption that I would fix whatever surfaced. At work, I reviewed a compliance memo about donor-restricted funds and caught myself rereading the same paragraph 3 times. The language was familiar, the implications were not. The rules were clear. Money given for one purpose could not be quietly redirected for another, no matter how noble the intention, no matter how trusted the people involved, especially not quietly. At lunch, I ate at my desk and opened the shared charity drive again. This time, I wasn't browsing casually. I was looking for patterns. There were dozens of folders labeled by year. Inside them, financial summaries, donor acknowledgments, expense reports. Nothing screamed fraud. That almost made it worse. Everything looked just clean enough to pass at a glance, just messy enough that no one had ever taken a second look. I pulled up a spreadsheet titled Operational Adjustments. It listed transfers between accounts, reimbursements, and temporary reallocations. The notes column was sparse. Phrases like timing issue and approved verbally appeared again and again. Approved by whom was never specified. And there it was, threaded throughout the file like a watermark. My name. Not always as the initiator, sometimes as the reviewer, sometimes as the contact, sometimes as the justification. I hadn't written those notes. I knew my own habits. I documented everything. This wasn't my voice, but it used my authority, or at least the authority people assumed I had. I closed my laptop and leaned back in my chair, staring at the ceiling tiles above my desk. For years, I'd believed my value to my family came from being reliable, from being the one who didn't make waves, the one who understood the boring parts and handled them quietly so everyone else could focus on the meaningful work. This was the cost of that belief. That evening, Cheryl called. "Lauren, I want to clear the air," she said, her voice smooth, almost conciliatory. "I feel like things got a little tense last night." "I agree," I said. I was standing in my kitchen, laptop open, the charity's financials spread across my screen. "You know I trust you," she continued. "That's why I looped you in. You're the most competent person I know." There it was, the compliment sharpened just enough to feel like a blade. "Competent people need accurate information," I replied. A pause. "What are you implying?" "I'm not implying anything," I said. "I'm asking to see the original authorization documents where I agreed to these roles." "In X time." Another pause. Longer this time. "Lauren," she said carefully, "this isn't how nonprofits operate. We're flexible. We adapt. We don't get hung up on formalities the way corporations do." "I work in compliance for nonprofits," I said. "This is exactly how they operate." She sighed. "You're letting your job cloud your judgment. This is family." Family. That word landed differently now. "I need clarity," I said. "If my name is on these accounts, I need to understand why." Her tone cooled. "I think you're forgetting how much good this organization does." "I'm not forgetting," I said. "I'm making sure it can keep doing it." The call ended shortly after. Not angrily, just abruptly. That night, I sat on my couch and tried to remember when helping had started to feel like obligation, when saying yes had stopped being a choice and started being an expectation. It hadn't happened all at once. It never did. It happened in increments. In moments when it felt easier to comply than to explain, easier to sign than to question. I thought about my parents, about how proud they were of Cheryl's involvement in the community, how often they'd said, "She's the reason things run so smoothly." I wondered if they knew how much of that smoothness rested on me. On Friday afternoon, I received an email from the charity's treasurer, a retired accountant named Mark who rarely weighed in. "Lauren," he wrote, "can we talk? I have a few concerns about the upcoming audit." I replied immediately. We spoke later that day. His voice was cautious, professional. "I don't want to step on toes," he said, "but some of these records are unconventional." "I agree," I said. "I was under the impression you'd approved certain adjustments," he continued. "I didn't," I said. Not knowingly. There was a silence on the line, then a slow exhale. "That's what I was afraid of," he said. After we hung up, I opened my notebook and began writing things down. Dates, names, decisions I remembered making, and ones I didn't. I wasn't building a case, not yet. I was building a timeline. The more I wrote, the clearer it became. I hadn't been targeted because I was careless. I'd been chosen because I was competent and quiet. Because I asked the right questions at work and none at home. Because my credibility could absorb risk without anyone noticing. I thought back to something Cheryl had said once, years ago, when I hesitated over a last-minute request. "You don't mind," she'd said. "You're good at this." I'd smiled and agreed. Saturday morning, the board meeting went on without me. I watched the minutes populate the shared drive in real time. My name appeared again, cited as the compliance contact who would handle follow-up as needed. I closed the document and felt something settle in my chest. Not fear, not anger, resolve. I wasn't angry at Cheryl. Not exactly. I was angry at the structure that made this possible. At the unspoken rules that rewarded people who took and punished people who paused. At myself, for believing that being indispensable was the same as being respected. That afternoon, I went for a long walk through my neighborhood. Kids rode bikes on the sidewalk. Someone grilled in their backyard, the smell of charcoal drifting through the air. Life went on, oblivious to the quiet shift happening inside me. I realized then that the value being violated wasn't money or reputation, it was consent. My right to know what I was responsible for. My right to say no without being framed as selfish or disruptive. That night, I drafted an email. Not accusatory, not emotional, just precise. "I need a full accounting of any documents, accounts, or filings where my name appears," I wrote. "Effective immediately, I am revoking any informal authorization previously assumed. Please direct all future requests through proper channels." I read it twice, then I saved it as a draft. I wasn't ready to send it yet. Because I knew what would happen when I did. The tone would change. The story would shift. People who'd praised my reliability would question my loyalty. Before bed, I checked my bank app again. No new transfers. The quiet felt temporary. As I turned off the light, one thought stayed with me, steady and unignorable. I hadn't been helping. I had been absorbing risk. And once you see that, you can't unsee it. The strange thing about realizing you've been absorbing risk for other people is that nothing on the outside changes right away. No alarms go off. No one confronts you. The same requests keep coming, dressed up in the same polite language, as if the ground beneath you hasn't shifted at all. On Monday morning, Cheryl emailed me a spreadsheet with the subject line, "Quick cleanup." No greeting, no explanation, just an attachment and the unspoken assumption that I would open it, review it, and make whatever problem disappear. I didn't respond. Instead, I forwarded it to a separate folder and labeled it with the date and time. Then I went back to my actual job and spent 3 hours reviewing a client's internal controls, flagging issues that mirrored what I was now seeing at home. Missing approvals, blurred roles, decisions made verbally and documented later, if at all. The irony wasn't lost on me. Around mid-morning, my phone rang. Cheryl again. "Lauren, did you see my email?" she asked, skipping any pretense. "Yes," I said. And? And I'm not handling it. There was a pause, sharp enough to feel deliberate. What do you mean? You're not handling it, she said. I mean exactly that, I replied. I'm not reviewing or editing any documents related to the charity until roles are clarified. Her tone shifted, just slightly. This is getting blown out of proportion. As it, I don't think it is. You're making things harder than they need to be, she said. We're volunteers. This isn't some corporate audit. It's still regulated, I said. And my name is still on the line. She sighed. You're being dramatic. That word landed harder than anything else she'd said. I ended the call before I could respond in a way I'd regret. By the end of the week, the pressure came from other directions. A board member emailed to ask if I could just confirm a few numbers before they went out to donors. Another asked if I'd be available for a call to smooth things over. The language was always soft, collaborative, reasonable. None of it acknowledged the actual issue. At dinner with my parents that Friday, my mom brought it up casually, the way she always did when something uncomfortable needed to be addressed without being named. Cheryl says you've been stressed lately, she said, passing me the salad bowl. I've been busy, I replied. She's worried you're taking things too personally, my dad added. You know how nonprofits are. Everyone pitches in. I set my fork down. Do you know my name is on their bank accounts? They exchanged a look. Well, my mom said carefully, you help them, don't you? That's not the same thing, I said. My dad frowned. You've always been responsible. Responsible. Another word that sounded like praise and felt like a trap. That night, I went home and opened the folder I'd been building. It was growing faster than I expected. Emails, meeting notes, financial summaries. Each one on its own looked harmless. Together, they told a story of gradual, systematic drift, of boundaries assumed instead of agreed upon. I started noticing how often the phrase "everyone agreed" appeared in documentation, without any record of who that actually included. How often my name appeared as a stabilizing factor, the quiet reassurance that things were under control. They were under control, just not by the people who claimed to be in charge. The following Tuesday, an email arrived from the IRS liaison assigned to the audit. It was polite, procedural, and deeply unsettling. We may need to speak with all listed responsible parties, it read. Please confirm your availability. I stared at the screen, my pulse steady but my hands cold. Responsible party. That was the first time I saw the phrase applied to me directly, without euphemism. I forwarded the email to Cheryl with a simple note. We need to talk. Her response came quickly. Too quickly. Let's not panic, she wrote. These things resolve themselves all the time. They don't, I thought. We met the next evening at her house. She lived in a tidy split level with neutral walls and framed photos of charity events lining the hallway. In every picture, she was smiling, shaking hands, standing just slightly off-center so the focus remained on the cause. She poured tea and gestured for me to sit. Lauren, she said, folding her hands, I think you're misunderstanding the situation. Then explain it, I said. She leaned back. You've always been involved in the operational side. Your expertise is valuable. When we listed you as a contact, it was because you were already acting in that capacity. End quote. I was reviewing documents, I said, not assuming legal responsibility. She waved a hand. That's semantics. It's not, I said. It's the difference between advice and liability. Her smile faded. Do you know what happens if you step back now? She asked. The board will panic. Donors will ask questions. The audit could escalate. And? I said. And people will suffer, she said quietly. Services could be cut. Staff could lose jobs. There it was again. The moral weight placed squarely on my shoulders. You're asking me to take responsibility for decisions I didn't make, I said. I'm asking you to stand by the organization you've supported for years, she replied. I shook my head. Those aren't the same thing. Her eyes hardened. I didn't think you'd be like this. Like what? So rigid, she said. So ungrateful. Ungrateful, the word echoed. I stood. I'm not signing anything else. And I'm not serving as a buffer anymore. Adam is past. Her jaw tightened. If you do this, she said, you're going to make a lot of people very uncomfortable. I met her gaze. I already am. Driving home, I realized something unsettling. The pushback wasn't coming because I was wrong. It was coming because the system depended on my silence, on my willingness to smooth, fix, absorb. At work, I'd seen this dynamic play out countless times. The most competent people quietly carrying the most risk because they were capable of it. The loudest people taking credit because they could. The difference now was that this system wore the face of family. By the end of the week, the charity's tone shifted again. Emails grew shorter, less friendly. I was CC'd rather than addressed. Decisions were made without my input, then sent to me after the fact, for awareness. And still, my name remained on the documents. One evening, as I sorted through old files, I noticed something I'd missed before. A scanned authorization form from 3 years earlier. The signature block was mine. I zoomed in. The signature wasn't mine. It was close enough to pass at a glance. Same looping first letter, same slant, but the pressure was wrong, the spacing off. Anyone who knew my handwriting would have noticed. I sat back, my heart beating a little faster now. This wasn't just assumption. Someone had crossed a line. I saved the file and labeled it carefully. Then I closed my laptop and sat in the dark, listening to the quiet of my apartment. For the first time since this began, anger rose, slow and controlled. Not the kind that explodes, but the kind that sharpens focus. They hadn't just leaned on my reliability. They decided they could speak for me. And that changed everything. The IRS interview request came on a Thursday afternoon, tucked between 2 routine work emails, like it didn't belong to a different universe entirely. The subject line was neutral, almost polite. Request for clarification regarding listed responsible parties. If you didn't know what it meant, you might have ignored it. If you did, your stomach tightened the way mine did as soon as I finished reading the second paragraph. They wanted to speak with me directly. Not as a volunteer, not as an advisor. As a responsible party. The email included a proposed date and time, a list of documents to prepare, and a reminder that participation was mandatory. No accusation, no threat, just procedure. That was what made it dangerous. I closed my laptop and sat there for a long moment, hands resting flat on the desk, forcing myself to breathe normally. Outside my office window, the parking lot looked exactly the same as it had an hour earlier. Cars came and went. Someone laughed as they walked past. Life continued, indifferent to the fact that a line had just been crossed. This was the point of no return. Until now, everything had existed in a gray zone. Assumptions, informal arrangements, social pressure disguised as family loyalty, all of it messy but deniable. The IRS didn't operate in gray zones. They reduced things to paper, signatures, and responsibility. And on paper, the responsibility was mine. I forwarded the email to Cheryl with a single sentence. They've requested a direct interview with me. Her reply came within minutes. Okay, let's stay calm. This happens. I stared at the words. This happens. As if being questioned by federal regulators was a normal inconvenience, like a delayed flight or a scheduling conflict. I typed back, I need full access to all financial records immediately. There was a longer pause this time. Then, that's not necessary. We can coordinate responses. Coordinate. Another word that suddenly felt dangerous. No, I wrote. I need them for my own protection. The typing indicator appeared, disappeared, then appeared again. I think you're assuming the worst, Cheryl finally replied. You need to trust me. I didn't answer. That evening, I went home and pulled every document I had saved into one place. I printed the most important ones and laid them out on my kitchen table. Emails, spreadsheets, meeting minutes, authorization forms. The forged signature sat in the center, face up. Seeing it in ink instead of pixels made something shift in my chest. It wasn't abstract anymore. It was physical. Someone had taken my name and used it as a shield. I thought about how calm Cheryl had been, how confident, how certain that things could still be managed, spun, contained. I'd seen that confidence before in executives who assumed systems existed to protect them, not to expose them. I slept badly that night, waking up at odd hours with fragments of old conversations replaying in my head, comments I'd brushed off, jokes about me being the adult in the room, compliments that now sounded like positioning. By morning, my phone was already buzzing. A board member I barely knew left a voicemail asking if everything was okay and whether I'd be available to clear up a misunderstanding. Another texted to say Cheryl was pretty upset and hoped I wasn't taking things personally. I didn't respond to any of them. Instead, I called an attorney. Not one connected to my family, not one recommended by a friend of a friend. A compliance attorney whose name I found the same way I found most professionals in my life, through quiet research and reviews written by people with nothing to gain from praising them. Her name was Karen Patel. Her voice was calm, direct, and entirely uninterested in soothing my feelings. "Send me everything," she said after I explained the situation. "And don't sign anything, don't agree to anything, don't attend any meetings without representation." "What about the IRS interview?" I asked. "We'll prepare," she said. "But understand this. They're not your enemy. They're trying to understand a system. Your job is to tell the truth." That word again. Truth. After the call, I felt steadier. Not because things were better, but because I was no longer handling them alone. Cheryl called again that afternoon. I let it go to voicemail. Her message was different this time, tighter, less polished. "Lauren, we need to talk before you make any decisions you can't take back," she said. "You're blowing this up in a way that could hurt a lot of people. Call me." I didn't. That night, I met Karen at her office. It was small, quiet, and unremarkable. No framed awards. No inspirational quotes, just shelves of binders and a desk covered in files. She listened without interrupting as I walked her through everything. When I finished, she leaned back and exhaled slowly. "You're not the first person this has happened to," she said. "And you won't be the last. Organizations like this often run on informal power structures. When something goes wrong, they look for the most credible person to absorb the impact." "Me," I said. She nodded. "You have expertise. You have a clean record, and you trusted them." I thought about how often I'd equated trust with virtue, how proud I'd been of it. "What do I do now?" I asked. "You stop protecting them," she said simply. "You provide accurate information when asked. Nothing more, nothing less." The following week was a blur of preparation. We organized documents, built timelines, highlighted inconsistencies. Karen didn't editorialize. She didn't speculate. She focused on facts. On Tuesday morning, I sat across from my laptop for the IRS interview, Karen beside me on the screen. The agent was professional, methodical. He asked about my role, my understanding of my responsibilities, how my name came to be listed. I answered honestly. "I was not aware I was designated as a responsible party," I said. "I did not authorize the use of my signature on that document." There was a pause on the other end. "You're saying this signature is not yours?" he asked. "Yes. It's alive to now." Karen slid the comparison documents into the shared folder. "Understood," the agent said. "We'll need to look into that." When the call ended, I sat there, drained but clear. I hadn't accused anyone. I hadn't dramatized anything. I'd simply told the truth. Within hours, the tone shifted again. Emails from the charity stopped altogether. Then one arrived from Cheryl, this time copying the entire board. "Given recent developments, we are revisiting certain administrative processes," she wrote. "Lauren has expressed discomfort with her involvement, and we respect her wishes." Discomfort. As if this were about feelings. I closed the email and leaned back in my chair. The inciting event, the moment that forced everything into motion, hadn't been the forged signature or the audit notice alone. It was the realization that the people I'd trusted were willing to let me carry consequences they were unwilling to face themselves. And now that the system was looking directly at them, they were already rewriting the story. But it was too late for that. I wasn't going to correct their narrative. I was going to let the truth do its work. Once you stop protecting people, the truth has room to move. That was the lesson I learned in the days after the interview, when silence replaced the constant buzz of requests I'd grown used to. No quick questions, no forwarded spreadsheets, no friendly nudges framed as favors. The quiet wasn't peaceful, it was watchful. Karen warned me it would happen. "When systems are exposed," she said during one of our check-ins, They often freeze before they fracture. She was right. The charity's board called an emergency meeting without inviting me. I found out about it the same way I'd found out about so many things lately through a document upload time-stamped at 9:17 p.m. The meeting minutes were sparse. Vague language. Action items deferred. A note that legal counsel would be consulted. My name didn't appear once. At work, I tried to focus on my actual responsibilities, but my mind kept drifting back to the files Karen and I were still reviewing. With distance, patterns became clearer. The story wasn't about one forged signature or one misplaced transfer. It was about a structure that had quietly evolved to funnel risk downward toward the person least likely to object. Me. Karen called it liability buffering. I called it betrayal. One afternoon, as I combed through old emails, I noticed something I'd missed before. A recurring thread titled Continuity Planning. It went back nearly 4 years. I opened the earliest message. Cheryl had written it. "We should make sure Lauren remains listed for continuity," the email read. "It reassures donors and simplifies reporting. No mention of consent, no mention of scope, just reassurance." As I scrolled, my chest tightened. The thread wasn't internal chatter. It included multiple board members, people I'd greeted warmly at fundraisers, people who'd thanked me for my help. They all knew my name was being used to steady the ship. They just hadn't cared enough to ask if I knew. I forwarded the thread to Karen. "This establishes awareness," she replied. "Not criminal intent, necessarily, but knowledge. Knowledge mattered." That evening, my mom called. "Cheryl is really upset," she said without preamble. "She feels blindsided." I closed my eyes. I was blindsided too. "She says you went straight to a lawyer," my mom continued, her voice tight. "That you didn't even try to work it out." "I did try," I said. "I asked questions." "And you couldn't just let it go?" she asked. "For the sake of the family?" There it was. The unspoken expectation laid bare. "Let what go?" I asked. "My name being used without my consent? My signature being forged?" My mom was quiet for a moment. "I don't understand why it has to be this serious." "It's serious because it's real," I said. "Because if something goes wrong, I'm the one on record." She sighed. "Cheryl's done so much good." "So have I," I said quietly. The line went silent. When she spoke again, her tone had softened. "I just don't want this to tear everyone apart." I thought about that for a long time after we hung up. About how often I'd been asked to carry discomfort so others didn't have to. About how easily my peace had been traded for theirs. The next development came unexpectedly. An email from the charity's new legal counsel arrived late Friday afternoon. It was addressed to me directly, polite and formal. "We are conducting an internal review of governance practices," it read. "Your cooperation would be appreciated." Karen reviewed it and nodded. "This is where things get interesting," she said. "They're realizing the narrative isn't holding." I agreed to meet. The lawyer, a man in his 50s with a careful manner, asked me to walk through my involvement from the beginning. I did, sticking to facts, dates, documents, statements I could support. When I finished, he folded his hands. "Were you ever explicitly asked to assume legal responsibility?" he asked. "No," I said. "And had you known your name was being used in this capacity, would you have agreed?" "No," he nodded slowly. "Thank you for your candor." After the meeting, Karen called. "They're trying to assess exposure," she said. "And to be frank, you're not it." That was the first time I felt a flicker of relief. But relief was short-lived. The following week, Cheryl emailed me directly for the first time since the interview. The tone was markedly different. "I wish you'd trusted me," she wrote. "We could have handled this quietly." Quietly. The word landed like a bruise. "I trusted you," I replied. "That's why this happened." She didn't respond. Instead, a rumor began circulating, subtle at first, whispers that I'd overreacted, that I'd brought in outsiders unnecessarily, that I'd jeopardized funding over a misunderstanding. I heard it secondhand, through friends of friends, through the slight shift in how people greeted me at church, through the way conversations stopped when I walked into a room. It hurt more than I expected. Karen reminded me this was part of the process. "When power is threatened," she said, "it deflects." I kept my head down. focused on facts, on cooperating when asked, on not correcting every false assumption. It was harder than any audit I'd ever worked on. One evening, as I sorted through the last batch of documents, I noticed a small but telling detail. A donor acknowledgement letter sent 2 years earlier, thanking contributors for their confidence in the organization's robust compliance oversight. The letter was signed by Cheryl, and below her signature, in smaller print, was my name, listed as compliance officer. I stared at it for a long time. This wasn't just about risk absorption. It was about image, about credibility borrowed without permission, about a story told so often it had become truth to everyone except the person it centered on. I forwarded the letter to Karen. "This matters," she said. "It shows reliance on your perceived role." Days later, the IRS requested additional documentation. The charity complied, slowly, carefully. Their responses grew more formal, more cautious. The easy confidence Cheryl had once projected was gone. The board announced that an independent audit firm had been retained. Cheryl stepped down from day-to-day operations, temporarily. No one called me to explain. No one apologized. The narrative simply shifted, as if this were an inevitable evolution rather than a consequence of choices. I watched it happen with a strange mix of sadness and clarity. I hadn't set out to dismantle anything. I'd only wanted my name back. One night, as I prepared for bed, I caught my reflection in the bathroom mirror. I looked tired, but steadier, older somehow, like someone who'd crossed an invisible line and couldn't return. I realized then that the evidence I'd uncovered wasn't just documentation. It was proof of a role I'd never agreed to play. Proof that good intentions weren't enough to keep you safe. Proof that silence could be mistaken for consent. The charity would survive, or it wouldn't. That outcome was no longer mine to manage. What was mine was the truth. And for the first time, I was letting it stand on its own. The hardest part wasn't the audit. It wasn't the rumors or the way conversations bent around me like I was suddenly made of sharp edges. The hardest part was sitting alone with the question I couldn't avoid anymore. What did I actually want to happen? For most of my life, I'd operated on reflex. Fix the issue, smooth the process, absorb the discomfort so others didn't have to feel it. That instinct had been praised so often it had hardened into identity. I was the reliable one, the reasonable one, the one who didn't overreact. Now that reflex had nowhere to go. In the quiet weeks after Cheryl stepped back, I felt untethered. There were no emergencies to solve, no spreadsheets to reconcile, no late-night emails demanding immediate attention. Without the constant pull of responsibility, something uncomfortable surfaced. Anger. Not explosive anger. Not the kind that demands witnesses. It was slower than that. Heavier. It showed up in small moments when I passed the charity's building on my drive home, when I deleted old emails and saw how casually my name had been used, when someone at church smiled too brightly and asked how I was holding up. I wasn't holding up. I was deciding. Karen and I met one afternoon to review the latest updates. The independent audit was underway. The IRS had not issued findings yet, but their tone had shifted from exploratory to focused. "They're narrowing in," Karen said. "This will take time." "And Cheryl?" I asked. "She's lawyering up," Karen replied, "which is expected." I nodded, absorbing that. Cheryl, who'd always preached transparency and trust, now needed protection. The irony was sharp enough to sting. "What happens if they ask me to formally distance myself?" I asked. Karen studied me. "What do you want to do?" The question caught me off guard. I was used to being told what needed to be done, not asked what I wanted. "I don't know," I admitted. "Part of me wants to walk away completely. Let them deal with the fallout. And the other part?" I hesitated. "The other part doesn't want to become the villain in everyone else's story." Karen leaned back. "You don't control the story. You control your boundaries." Boundaries. Another word I'd always admired in theory and struggled with in practice. That night, I lay awake thinking about my family, about my parents' discomfort, about how easily my actions had been reframed as betrayal rather than self-protection. I understood their fear. They'd built their sense of stability on the idea that people like Cheryl handled things, that nothing truly bad could happen under her watch. I was threatening that belief. I thought about the charity's clients, the patients who relied on its services, the volunteers who believed in the mission. None of them had asked for this. None of them deserved to suffer because of governance failures they had no hand in creating. This was the moral knot at the center of everything. If I pushed too hard, the organization could collapse. If I stepped back entirely, others might carry consequences they didn't deserve. And if I tried to manage the outcome, I risked repeating the same pattern that had put me here. There was no clean answer. The next morning, I received an unexpected email from Mark, the treasurer. "I wanted to apologize," he wrote. "I should have questioned things sooner. I didn't because I assumed you were overseeing it." I stared at the screen for a long time. He hadn't meant to burden me. He'd simply trusted the structure presented to him, just like everyone else. I replied carefully. "I appreciate that," I wrote. "But I wasn't overseeing it, and that's the problem." His response came quickly. "I know that now. If there's anything I can do to support a transparent process, let me know." I closed my laptop and sat back. This was what responsibility actually looked like. Not control, not silence, but willingness to face uncomfortable truths. That afternoon, I drove to my parents' house unannounced. My mom looked surprised when I walked in, but she didn't ask questions. She never did at first. She waited to see which version of me had arrived. We sat at the kitchen table, the same one where I'd done homework as a kid, where decisions were discussed indirectly and feelings were managed with politeness. "I'm not trying to hurt anyone," I said finally. My mom folded her hands. "Then why does it feel like everything is falling apart?" "Because it was built on something fragile," I said, "and no one wanted to see it." She shook her head. "Cheryl always meant well." "I know," I said. "So did I. It's Clave the Demanger." She looked at me then, really looked at me, as if seeing something unfamiliar. "What do you want?" she asked quietly. I took a breath. "I want my name off things I didn't agree to. I want clarity. And I want to stop being asked to carry responsibility without authority." She nodded slowly. "And if that costs us our image?" I thought about that. About how much image had already cost me. "Then that's the price," I said. Leaving their house, I felt both lighter and sadder. Lighter because I'd finally said it out loud. Sadder because I knew not everyone would accept it. In the weeks that followed, I was asked formally this time whether I wished to remain associated with the charity in any capacity. The question came from the new interim board chair, carefully worded and neutral. I asked for time. This was the moment where my choice would shape the ending. Not legally, that was already in motion, but morally. I could sever ties, protecting myself completely. Or I could remain, under explicit, documented terms, to help stabilize the organization during the transition. Both options carried weight. I met with Karen again, laying it all out. "If I stay," I said, "I risk being pulled back into something unhealthy." "If you leave," she replied, "you risk being painted as abandoning ship." "And if I try to help?" She smiled faintly. "Then you need conditions. Real ones." That night, I drafted a document. Not a resignation. Not an agreement. A statement of boundaries. I outlined what I would and would not do. What authority I required. What documentation was necessary. What roles I refused to assume under any circumstances. I wrote it slowly, deliberately, resisting the urge to soften language for the sake of harmony. When I finished, I felt something close to calm. This wasn't revenge. It wasn't forgiveness either. It was self-respect, practiced in real time. The next morning, I sent the document to the interim board and copied Karen. "I'm willing to assist during the transition under these conditions," I wrote. "If they can't be met, I will step away." There it was, my line in the sand. As I hit send, my hands didn't shake, my heart didn't race. I felt grounded in a way I hadn't before. For the first time, I wasn't reacting to pressure. I was choosing. And whatever happened next, I knew one thing with certainty. I would never again confuse being useful with being valued. The response came 2 days later. Not immediately. Not with urgency. That, in itself, told me everything I needed to know. The interim board chair's email was polite, measured, and carefully non-committal. "Thank you for your willingness to assist. We appreciate your professionalism." We need time to review your proposed conditions. Time. Another familiar word. The kind that usually meant someone hoped the problem would soften if left alone long enough. I forwarded the message to Karen. "They're testing whether you'll blink," she replied. I didn't. In the meantime, I kept doing what I'd promised myself I would do. Nothing extra. No stepping in to smooth conversations. No fixing documents that weren't mine to fix. No answering questions framed as favors instead of responsibilities. The effect was immediate. Small cracks appeared. A board member emailed asking where a particular compliance file was stored. I replied with the location and nothing else. Another asked if I could just glance at a draft response to a donor. I declined politely and suggested they route it through counsel. Each refusal felt strange. Not because it was wrong, but because it was new. For years, I'd equated helpfulness with virtue. Now I was learning that restraint could be just as ethical. The first real test came at the end of the week. Cheryl reached out. Not by email, by phone. I watched it ring until it went to voicemail. A few minutes later, a text appeared. "We should talk. Just us." I stared at the screen. This was the moment I'd anticipated and dreaded. The private conversation, the appeal to history, to family, to all the unspoken obligations that had governed my behavior for so long. I typed back, "If you want to discuss this, my attorney will need to be present." The reply was almost immediate. "Seriously?" "Yes," I wrote. There was no response after that. That evening, I took a long walk through my neighborhood. The air was warm, heavy with the smell of cut grass. Porch lights flickered on one by one as dusk settled. Everything looked normal, peaceful. It struck me how easily dysfunction could hide behind familiar routines. I thought about the choice I'd made. Not to attack, not to disappear, but to stay present, without being available in the way I used to be. This was the difference between disengagement and boundaries. Disengagement was absence. Boundaries were visibility with limits. On Monday morning, Karen called. "They've agreed to most of your conditions," she said. "With one exception." I closed my eyes. "Which one?" "They want flexibility around emergency approvals," she said. "They're asking that you be available to authorize certain actions if timing becomes critical." Of course they were. "That's exactly the loophole," I said. "I know," Karen replied. "What do you want to do?" I thought about it. About how many times just this once had become always. About how emergencies had a way of being defined by whoever needed something fastest. "No," I said. "If they need emergency authority, they can appoint someone formally, not me." Karen smiled. I could hear it in her voice. "I'll relay that." The revised agreement came back the next day. Clean. Specific. My role limited to advisory support during the transition, with no signing authority, no financial responsibility, and a clear end date. Everything documented, everything transparent. I read it twice, then a third time. This was what it looked like when expectations were made explicit, when help wasn't confused with obligation, when consent wasn't assumed. I signed. The shift in dynamics was subtle but profound. Meetings changed. People spoke more carefully. Questions were directed to the right roles. Decisions took longer because they had to be discussed instead of quietly handled. It was inefficient. It was also honest. During one meeting, a board member asked if I could just take this on since I had the background. I paused, then redirected the task to the appropriate committee. No one argued. Afterward, Mark pulled me aside. "I didn't realize how much you were carrying," he said. "We all got used to it." I nodded. "So did I. It's 7 until you coming in Dio. 2000 in Dio. That was the strange part. I hadn't just trained them. I'd trained myself." Cheryl remained absent. Officially on leave. Unofficially. She'd become the unspoken center of every conversation. No one criticized her directly. No one defended her either. Her name hovered, heavy with implication. One afternoon, as I reviewed transition documents, I noticed something telling. Several processes Cheryl had personally overseen were undocumented. Decisions had lived in her head, enforced by her authority. Without her, the system struggled. This wasn't vindicating. It was sad. I wondered if she'd ever realized how much power she'd held simply because no one else wanted to deal with the mess. How often control masqueraded as competence when it was really avoidance. The IRS findings arrived a few weeks later. No criminal charges, but significant governance failures. Required corrective actions, public disclosure to certain donors. The charity would survive, but not unchanged. The board accepted the findings. New controls were implemented, roles clarified, oversight formalized. It was all very procedural, very calm. What wasn't calm was the undercurrent of realization moving through the community. People started asking questions, not accusatory ones, curious ones. How had this happened? Why hadn't anyone noticed sooner? No one mentioned my name. And for once, that was exactly right. Cheryl reached out again after the findings were announced, this time by email. "I never meant for this to get so far," she wrote. "I thought you understood that." I read the message slowly. Understanding wasn't the issue. "I did understand," I replied. "That's why I had to stop." She didn't write back. That night, I sat alone in my apartment, the same kitchen table where this had begun now cleared of documents and files. I checked my bank app out of habit. Everything lined up. The quiet felt different now, not watchful, earned. I realized then that the choice I'd made to stay, but only under clear terms, had done something unexpected. It hadn't just protected me, it had forced everyone else to confront their own roles. There was no villain exposed, no dramatic reckoning, just a slow, unavoidable shift. And that, I was learning, was sometimes more unsettling than confrontation, because when you don't destroy people, when you simply stop compensating for them, they're left alone with what they built. And they have to decide whether to fix it or live with it. Not the kind that comes with headlines or public accusations, but the quieter kind, the slow realization that without someone absorbing the friction, everything feels sharper, louder, more uncomfortable. The first sign came from a donor luncheon. I hadn't planned to attend. My role no longer required it, and frankly, I didn't trust myself to sit in a room full of polite smiles without noticing what had changed. But the interim chair asked if I would come, not to speak, not to present, just to be present. "People are asking questions," she said. "It helps when they see familiar faces." I agreed, on one condition. I wouldn't answer anything outside my defined scope. The luncheon was held at a country club on the edge of town. Beige walls, neutral art, the smell of coffee and catered chicken salad. The kind of place designed to feel reassuring, stable. As I walked in, conversations dipped, then resumed. Nothing dramatic, just a subtle recalibration. People noticed me now in a different way, not as the invisible fixer, but as a variable. A woman I recognized from past events approached me with a polite smile. "Lauren," she said, "it's been a while. How are things?" "Busy," I replied. True, but noncommittal. "I heard there were some changes," she continued carefully. "At the charity." "Yes," I said. "There were—" She waited. I didn't fill the silence. "Oh," she said after a moment. "Well, I suppose these things happen." They do, I thought. When no one wants to ask how. Across the room, I spotted Cheryl's absence like a missing tooth. She used to command these spaces effortlessly, floating from group to group, dispensing reassurance with practiced ease. Without her, the board members looked slightly adrift, unsure who should take the lead. At one point, a donor asked a direct question about oversight. The interim chair answered with a prepared response, measured and correct, but lacking Cheryl's confidence. There was no spin, just facts. The room felt different. Afterward, Mark joined me near the exit. "This is harder without her," he admitted quietly. "It's supposed to be," I said. He nodded. "I think we relied on her more than we realized. Or more than you wanted to admit," I thought. A few days later, the charity announced a restructuring of its leadership, not dramatic, not punitive, just a formal acknowledgement that Cheryl would not be returning to her previous role. A new governance committee would be formed, responsibilities redistributed. The email was respectful, almost generous. Cheryl's name appeared once, framed by gratitude. I didn't feel vindicated reading it. I felt tired. The real turning point came the following week. in a conversation I hadn't expected. My mother called. I ran into Cheryl at the grocery store, she said. I closed my eyes. How was she? Not great, my mom admitted. She said people are treating her differently. I waited. She thinks you turned everyone against her. There it was. The accusation I'd been bracing for. I didn't, I said. I stopped covering. My mom was quiet. Then, reluctantly, she said you could have handled it more privately. I exhaled slowly. She had years of privacy. My mom sighed. I don't know what to think anymore. That, I realized, was the point where the narrative finally broke. When the people who'd accepted the old story without question began to feel its weight, Cheryl reached out one last time, requesting a meeting. Not through lawyers. Not through the board. Directly. I considered it carefully. Karen advised against it. There's nothing to gain, she said. She was right, legally. But this wasn't about law. It was about closure. We met at a cafe halfway between our houses. Neutral ground. No audience. She looked older than I remembered. Tired. Her confidence, once so effortless, now felt strained. I never meant to put you in danger, she said without preamble. I know, I replied. And I did. That was the hardest part. You could have come to me, she continued. Before it got out of hand. I did, I said. You told me I was overreacting. She winced. I was trying to protect the organization. At my expense. She looked away. You were strong, capable. I thought you could handle it. The words hung between us. That's not protection, I said quietly. That's outsourcing risk. Her jaw tightened. You didn't have to make it so public. I didn't make it public, I said. I answered questions when asked. She laughed softly, without humor. You always were literal. I didn't respond. What do you want from me? She asked finally. I considered the question, carefully, honestly. Nothing, I said. I wanted accountability. That's already happened. She studied me, as if searching for something. You don't care what people think of you now? I do, I said. Just not more than I care about myself. She nodded slowly. I guess that's the difference between us. We sat in silence for a moment. Then she stood, gathering her coat. I hope it was worth it, she said. I met her gaze. It was. After she left, I sat there for a long time, watching people come and go. Ordinary lives, ordinary problems. No villains, no heroes, just choices and their consequences. In the weeks that followed, the fallout settled into something quieter. The charity stabilized under its new structure. Donors adjusted. The community moved on, as communities always do. Cheryl withdrew from public life, not dramatically. She still attended church, still smiled politely, but the authority she once wielded was gone, not taken, released. And I was no longer part of the machinery that had sustained it. One evening, as I cleaned out old files on my laptop, I came across an early email from Cheryl, years ago. You don't mind, she'd written. You're good at this. I deleted it. Not out of anger, out of clarity. The truth was, I had minded. I just hadn't known how to say it. Now I did. And that knowledge, quiet, firm, irreversible, was the real shift. By the time the charity released its final compliance update, the crisis phase was officially over. The language was clean and restrained, governance gaps identified, corrective actions implemented, oversight strengthened. The kind of document that reassures regulators and quietly exhausts everyone else. I read it once, then closed the file. There was nothing in it for me anymore. That realization came with an unexpected mix of relief and grief. For months, my life had revolved around documents, timelines, and conversations weighted with consequence. Now the machine had moved on without me. It didn't need my vigilance anymore. The system had absorbed the shock and rebalanced. And I was left standing outside it, suddenly unnecessary. For the first time since this started, I had no next step. At work, things returned to their usual rhythm. Reviews, meetings, deadlines that mattered in a contained, professional way. My colleagues didn't know the details of what had happened, only that I'd been dealing with something personal. I let that stand. It was easier than explaining a story that didn't fit neatly into a moral lesson. One afternoon, my manager asked if I'd consider leading a training session on nonprofit compliance best practices. "You have a way of explaining things clearly," she said. "People listen." I almost laughed. Almost. Instead, I said yes. Preparing for the session forced me to articulate principles I'd lived by without naming. Clear roles, documented authority, the danger of informal power structures. I spoke about risk not as something abstract, but as something that always lands on someone specific when things go wrong. As I talked, I noticed heads nodding, notes being taken, a few uncomfortable expressions. Good, I thought. Discomfort was where learning began. After the session, a colleague pulled me aside. "I needed to hear that," she said. "I've been carrying things that aren't technically my job because it felt easier than pushing back." I nodded. It always does, until it doesn't. That night, I went home and sat at my kitchen table, the same one where this had started months earlier. The surface was bare now. No stacks of paper. No highlighted documents. Just a mug of tea and the quiet hum of the apartment. I checked my phone. No messages from Cheryl. No updates from the board. No questions waiting to be answered. I realized something then. This was the consequence of not attacking anyone. If I had accused, shouted, demanded punishment, there would have been a clean narrative, a villain, a hero, a dramatic ending. Instead, there was this quieter aftermath, where everyone had to sit with what they'd allowed to happen, including me. In the days that followed, I declined a formal advisory role with the charity. The interim chair accepted my decision graciously. She understood, or at least, she said she did. "I think you've done more than enough," she told me. She was right. Letting go felt strange. Like setting down something heavy I'd been carrying for so long, I'd forgotten what it was like to have free hands. I didn't rush to fill the space. I let it exist. My parents adjusted slowly. At first, conversations were cautious, tiptoeing around the topic. Over time, they became more honest. "I didn't realize how much pressure you were under," my dad admitted one evening. "I thought you liked helping." "I did," I said. "I just didn't like being assumed." That distinction mattered more than I'd ever admitted. As for Cheryl, I heard about her occasionally. Through mutual acquaintances. Through passing comments. She was consulting privately now, advising smaller organizations. No leadership titles. No public visibility. Just work. I wondered sometimes if she understood what had happened. If she saw it as betrayal or inevitability. If she missed the authority or felt relieved to be free of it. I never asked. The final step came quietly, on a random Tuesday afternoon. Karen emailed to say the IRS had closed their inquiry. No further action required from me. My name would be formally removed from all filings. "That's it," she wrote. "You're clear." I read the email twice. Then I closed my laptop and sat there, letting the weight of those words sink in. "You're clear." Not vindicated, not triumphant, just free. That evening, I took out a notebook and wrote down a few things. Not notes, not reminders, observations. I wrote about how easily competence turns into expectation, about how silence can be mistaken for agreement, about how people who benefit from a system rarely question it until it stops working for them. I wrote about the difference between responsibility and ownership, about how true accountability requires consent, not just capability. When I finished, I tore out the pages and folded them neatly. Not to keep as evidence, just to mark the moment. As I turned off the light, one thought stayed with me, clear and steady. I hadn't won anything, but I hadn't lost myself either. And that was the point. In choosing not to destroy anyone, I'd forced something harder. The truth to stand without cushioning. Without my presence smoothing its edges. Without my competence disguising its flaws. The system had revealed itself. And once revealed, it could never go back to pretending I was the problem it needed to solve. I fell asleep that night with a sense of closure I hadn't expected, not the kind that comes from dramatic endings, but the kind that comes from alignment. My actions matched my values. My boundaries matched my capacity. And my silence when I chose it was no longer mistaken for consent. That was enough. The story everyone expected never really happened. There was no final confrontation, no dramatic apology, no public reckoning where someone stood up and admitted they were wrong. If people were waiting for that moment, it disappointed them. What happened instead was quieter, and in some ways, more unsettling. A month after the IRS closed its inquiry, the charity held its annual meeting. I didn't attend, not out of avoidance, but because my presence was no longer necessary. The interim chair sent me the agenda anyway, a courtesy more than an invitation. Later, I heard how it went. Attendance was lower than usual. Questions were sharper. Donors asked about controls, oversight, documentation. The board answered as best they could, reading from prepared statements, pointing to new policies. No one mentioned Cheryl by name, but everyone felt the absence. In the past, she would have fielded those questions effortlessly, redirecting concerns with warmth and authority. Now, without her voice smoothing the edges, the room sat in its discomfort longer. People shifted in their chairs. Follow-up questions piled up. The organization survived the meeting. Of course it did. Institutions usually do. What didn't survive was the illusion that things ran on goodwill alone. That was the twist no one talked about out loud. Cheryl hadn't been removed because of malice. She hadn't been exposed as a villain. She'd simply lost the thing that had made her powerful: unquestioned trust. And once that was gone, there was nothing dramatic to replace it, just a smaller role. Fewer calls, less influence. She hadn't been punished. She had been revealed. And revelation, I was learning, had consequences of its own. I ran into her one last time, unexpectedly, at a bookstore downtown. I almost didn't recognize her at first. She was dressed more casually than I'd ever seen her, standing alone near a display table, flipping through a paperback. We locked eyes. The moment stretched. I considered pretending I hadn't seen her. Walking past. Preserving distance. Instead, I nodded. She hesitated, then nodded back. We didn't speak. As I walked away, I realized something strange. I didn't feel triumphant or vindicated. I didn't feel sorry for her either. What I felt was acceptance of the outcome, of the limits of my control. She had made choices, so had I. That was all there was to it. Later that week, my mom invited me over for dinner. Just the two of us. No agenda, no careful framing. At one point, she set down her fork and looked at me. "I've been thinking about what you said," she admitted, "about carrying responsibility without authority." I waited. "I've done that my whole life," she said quietly. I just didn't have the words for it. This half did they have. That was the moment I hadn't known I needed. Not an apology, not an admission of guilt, just recognition. We sat in silence for a while after that, the kind that didn't feel heavy. My dad joined us later, and the conversation drifted to ordinary things. Work, the weather, plans for the weekend. Life resumed its familiar rhythm, altered but intact. That, too, was unexpected. I had braced myself for rupture, for permanent distance. Instead, there was recalibration. Awkward at times. Slower, but real. In the months that followed, I noticed changes in myself. I stopped volunteering reflexively. I paused before saying yes. I asked clarifying questions without apologizing for them. At work, I delegated more, trusted others to carry their own responsibilities. Some people bristled, others adapted. No one accused me of being difficult. They just adjusted to the fact that I wasn't cushioning every impact anymore. One evening, as I sorted through old files on my laptop, I found a draft email I'd never sent, written early in the process, when I was still trying to explain myself in a way that wouldn't upset anyone. It was long, careful, full of justifications. I deleted it. The person I'd written it for no longer existed. What struck me most, looking back, was how close I'd come to making a different choice. How easily I could have stepped away entirely, cut ties, let the organization implode under its own weight. That would have felt cleaner, simpler. But it would have also allowed everyone else to avoid seeing their part in it, to blame the collapse on one conflict, one person, one moment. By staying on my terms, I'd forced something harder. Accountability without a villain, change without destruction. That was the ethical twist I hadn't planned but couldn't ignore. I hadn't saved the organization. I hadn't punished anyone. I'd simply removed myself as a buffer. And without that buffer, the truth had nowhere to hide. Months later, Karen and I met for coffee. Not to discuss a case, just to catch up. "You handled that well," she said. "Most people either go scorched earth or disappear." "I thought about both," I admitted. She smiled. "You chose the option that required the most patience." "I don't know if I'd call it patience," I said. "More like exhaustion." She laughed. "That counts." As we parted, she said something that stayed with me. "Justice doesn't always look like consequences," she said. "Sometimes it looks like clarity." That night, back at my apartment, I stood at the window and watched the lights come on across the neighborhood, ordinary lives unfolding. People carrying invisible systems on their backs, just as I had. I couldn't fix that for them, and I didn't need to. What I could do was live differently, model something quieter, firmer. The ending wasn't dramatic. It was something better. It was sustainable. And for the first time, I understood that the absence of destruction didn't mean the absence of justice. Sometimes, justice arrives when you stop preventing it. And then you step back and let it do its work. The quiet that followed didn't feel empty. It felt earned. In the months after everything settled, my life didn't change in any dramatic, visible way. I didn't move cities. I didn't quit my job. I didn't reinvent myself with a new title or a public declaration. From the outside, nothing about me looked different. But inside, the architecture had shifted. I woke up one Saturday morning and realized I hadn't checked my phone in hours. No reflexive scanning. No low-level anxiety about what might be waiting. The habit had dissolved so gradually I hadn't noticed it leaving. I made coffee, stood at the counter, watched steam rise from the mug. Ordinary moments, finally uninterrupted. At work, the changes were subtle but unmistakable. When new projects came up, I asked one question before agreeing to anything. What authority comes with this responsibility? Not defensively, not confrontationally, just clearly. Sometimes the answer was satisfactory. Sometimes it wasn't. When it wasn't, I declined. And the world didn't end. A younger analyst on my team asked me once how I'd learned to be so firm. She'd just been assigned a task well outside her role and felt torn between wanting to help and feeling overwhelmed. "I used to think being indispensable was the goal," I told her. "Now I think being replaceable is healthier." She laughed, unsure if I was serious. I was. At home, my relationships recalibrated. My parents stopped asking me to just take a look at things without context. When they did ask for help, it came with clearer boundaries. And when I said no, they accepted it with something like respect, even if it took effort. The absence of constant negotiation created space for something else. Conversations that weren't transactional. Time that wasn't borrowed against future favors. I hadn't realized how much of my connection to them had been built on utility until it wasn't anymore. As for the charity, it continued on its quieter path. New leadership, more paperwork, less charm. It wasn't as smooth as it once had been. It also wasn't as fragile. Occasionally, I'd hear updates through the community grapevine. A new policy implemented. A donor who appreciated the transparency. A volunteer who struggled with the increased structure. It was harder work now. It was also honest. Cheryl faded from the story not because anyone pushed her out, but because there was no longer a role for the version of authority she'd embodied. The system no longer bent to accommodate informal control. It asked for documentation instead. She adapted, or she didn't. That part wasn't mine to manage. One afternoon, months later, I found myself cleaning out a drawer and came across an old notebook. Inside were notes from the early days of the crisis, half-formed thoughts, anxious questions, attempts to explain myself to an audience that no longer existed. I flipped through the pages, recognizing the voice but not the person. She was careful, defensive, still trying to be understood. I closed the notebook and set it aside. That version of me had done what she could with the tools she had. She deserved more credit than I'd given her. That evening, I took a walk as the sun dipped low, the air cooling just enough to be comfortable. Neighbors waved. Someone's dog barked. A kid rode past on a skateboard, wobbling and laughing. Life. Unspectacular and ongoing. I thought about how close I'd come to choosing a louder ending, to making my exit definitive and scorched, how satisfying that might have felt in the moment. I also thought about what it would have cost me. In choosing not to destroy anyone, I'd been forced to confront my own patterns without distraction, to sit with discomfort rather than redirect it outward, to accept that justice doesn't always arrive as punishment. Sometimes it arrives as alignment. Alignment between what you know is right and what you're willing to tolerate, between your skills and how they're used, between your generosity and your consent. I'd spent years believing that my job was to make systems work, even when they weren't designed to be fair. I believed that competence carried an obligation to compensate for dysfunction. I don't believe that anymore. Competence is not consent. Capability is not permission. And silence is not agreement. Those truths aren't radical, they're just inconvenient for systems built on quiet compliance. Late that night, I sat at my kitchen table one last time, the same spot where this story had begun. I didn't open my bank app. I didn't check my email. I didn't brace for impact. I wrote a single sentence on a scrap of paper and left it there overnight. I am not responsible for what I did not choose. In the morning, I threw it away. I didn't need to keep it. It was already integrated. This wasn't a story about winning, or even about justice in the traditional sense. No one went to jail. No one made a public confession. There were no villains dragged into the light. What happened instead was quieter and more enduring. A system lost its buffer. A person reclaimed her name, and the truth was allowed to function without interference. That's not a dramatic ending, but it is a true one. And for the first time in a long time, truth was enough.